Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's seminar organized by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I would also like to extend my welcome to those who have joined us online on the ISAS Facebook page. The seminar today is titled The Roots of Political Centralization in India. And to discuss this really important issue in Indian politics, we are delighted to have with us Dr. Neeraj Sirkar, Senior Fellow at the Center for Policy Research. The session today will be chaired by Dr. Diego Majorana, Senior Assistant Professor of Indian History and Politics at the University of Naples Le Oriental and Visiting Research Fellow here at ISAS. I will now hand over the session to Dr. Majorana.
Thank you. Welcome all. I thought I was supposed to introduce him, but it has already been done. Most of you know him anyway, but for those online, Dr. Sirkar works at CPR in Delhi, which is India's premier think tank or research institute. He's a political scientist who works on party voting behavior, political centralization, and welfare delivery. But also he has another hat, that of a policy researcher, that especially recently has brought him to analyze policies closely, especially in Andhra Pradesh, if I'm not wrong. So he recently co-edited a book, Colossus, Anatomy of Delhi, that look at is a comprehensive, I would say, picture of how this Colossus of a city works. I will not say much more, except that the talk of today is about political centralization, which is kind of a niche policy topic, but with very important real-life consequences. So much of the crisis in India today is probably due, well, it's to a significant extent due to political centralization, both of institutions and both in terms of political parties that stop functioning as check and balances and etc. But since he is the expert and not me, I will hand the floor to him. And I thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Diego. You can all hear me clearly. So I think before I get to the slides, I should tell you that I already warned Diego that this is in some ways a very disoriented talk. There are 2 or 3 threads. I'm going to try to be very clear about what those threads are. But let me just tell you a little bit of the motivation for this project. You know, in some sense, the talk is a bit of false advertising because while one hears the phrase political centralization, they might think, you know, what is happening in India right now in the last few years. I am tracing the period of political centralization that I'm interested in, at least, to a period in the 1990s. And I'm going to sort of try to argue towards the end that many of the things that we observe as characteristics of the political system today can be traced back to some of the things that we saw in the 1990s. But the other and sort of more important reason for taking on this project is that for those of us who study South Asia or comparative politics, there's a lot of policy literature, academic literature on what we call the Congress system, right? So pre-1977, what were the structure of political actors, political parties, Myron Wiener, Rajni Kothari, they're famous authors, right? We don't have that kind of characterization of the system 1980s onwards, and certainly not 1990s. What we do have are certain characteristics, right? We talk about the rise of certain caste communities. We talk about the rise of Hindu nationalism. We talk about the rise of criminality in politics, money in politics. But as a characterization, as a system, as an equilibrium, if you will, we don't have that kind of understanding of the period. And what I'm going to try to sort of argue is that developing that understanding can help us understand what's happening or what has happened hence. Okay? So ordered chaos is the name of the talk. To be clear why, it's a play on something in social choice theory, where there are conditions under which you get chaos and there are conditions under which you get order. And I'll try to explain why this makes sense. Okay, So I'm gonna first start with chaos, okay? Here is one imagination we have of India, okay? So the person on the left is a guy named Gaya Lal. He very famously defected from one political party to the next 3 times in a space of 2 weeks, okay? So much so that there is a famous quote associated with a fellow politician saying, Aya Ram, Gaya Ram, right? He came, and then he left. Ram came, Ram left. And, so this is to say that political defection and kind of political instability is not anything new in the Indian context. For those of you that have been following Indian politics a little more closely recently, we have a very complicated situation in the state of Maharashtra, where the initial party that was elected to government was an alliance between 2 parties, the Shiv Sena and the BJP. The Shiv Sena broke away from the BJP and formed a government with the opposition. Then parts of the opposition broke back away and joined up with the BJP to form the government. So the person's picture is a guy named Ajit Pawar. He is a relative of kind of the scion of the political party, Congress Party, who has broken away from the opposition, helped form the current government with the BJP. The third person I have here is a guy named Biplab Deb. He is was the first chief minister in a small state, Tripura, for the BJP. Now, what is interesting about the rise of the BJP is that it was a state that was characterized by competition between the communists and the Congress Party. And the Congress Party wholesale, wholesale meaning their votes are going from 30% to 2%, wholesale became the BJP party, right? So we're talking about various notions of defection and political instability. Now, this is one characterization we have of Indian politics. I'm going to argue that there is another characterization that we should be thinking about, which is a lot more order to it. So these are all parties that are known as the well-known small regional parties within India. The RJD, Rashtriya Janata Dal, which is associated with Lalu Prasad Yadav, the Trinamool Congress, which is associated with Mamata Banerjee, and the Shiv Sena, which has now been passed on to son, but is associated with Bal Thakur. Okay. Now, what is interesting about these 3 characters and these 3 parties is that they're typically associated with very different kinds of politics. So the RJD is associated with the rise of lower castes, a certain caste upward mobility, Janata Dal Party. The Trinamool Congress is associated with a clear breakaway from the Congress Party, and the Shiv Sena is associated with nativist politics, right? But what is interesting is that irrespective of what the ideological or ethnic foundations of each of these parties are, they look very similar in terms of party structure, right? They have a charismatic leader at top. Insofar as there is handing over, it is being handed over to a relative, right? So these are these sort of family-owned firms, highly centralized, low intra-party democracy, often which are active in the takeover of state institutions. Right? So this is the kind of centralization that we're seeing. And again, many of these parties come up in the 1990s, not all, like not Shiv Sena, for instance. We have another imagination of order, and this is some field notes. So I, separately from this kind of work, I do a lot of work on electoral behavior and the behavior of parties. And I just want to take you through some information I have from my field notes. So when I spoke to Dalit voters in Western UP, so from the most marginalized castes among the Hindu community, they spoke of a rivalry with other backward castes. And because of that, given the option between the BJP, which is in power in the state of Uttar Pradesh, and the Samajwadi Party, which is associated with the OBCs, many of the Dalit voters I spoke to would rather have voted for the BJP because it was understood that one of these 2 parties is likely to form government. So that was a group of voters that was strategic. At the same time, there was an understanding of sincere voting. So BSP is what has traditionally been a Dalit party, which is associated with Mayavati, but is dimming in popularity. So people understood that the BSP would not be forming government this time. So some people out of, sort of ethnic pride would vote for the BSP. There's a second Dalit party today, the Azad Samaj Party, which is sort of sympathetic to the BSP, but a separate party. And for various reasons, people might be more attuned to that. What I'm going to try to argue is that even this very, very complicated structure, right? It requires that at the constituency level, you know a lot about who is competitive. You know a lot about who might naturally form government. You need to know a lot about your own preferences. So very different from our chaotic notion of politics, right? So somebody who has a lot of information in order to develop their preferences. So we have these two notions of politics in India. We have order and we have chaos, right? And you can sort of see what order of chaos is coming in. Okay. So, let's get up for a second. So we have sort of two questions, and I'm sort of speaking to two very different audiences in this work. One is for people who sort of work on more general comparative politics and political theory. And sorry, I just didn't realize. There. So one question that we have, right, is that so much of what we understand about the structure of politics in comparative politics is developed by looking at politics in Western Europe and the United States. And there was an understanding that politics could be chaotic, but the reason why it is not chaotic, the reason why people have very stable parties, stable preferences, is that party support, ideology, are all fairly stable factors in each of these systems. That is not something that we tend to think characterizes the Indian system. So if we are going to argue that political preferences are somewhat stable, like I said about voters and like I said about parties, then we need to understand something about where that stability is coming from. The other thing I'm going to argue, which is for the context that I work in, is the Indian context. So much of the literature we've had over the last several decades has traced different lines of growth for political parties, whether it be caste, whether it be religion, whether it be some other nativist or ethnic challenge. If that's the case, if the key characteristic of parties are these social movements, then why do so many of the new parties look the same, right? That's the sort of set of questions that I'm going to be asking. And the argument that I'm going to be making, and that's related to some of the characters I showed you in the beginning, right, is that in order to survive, new parties need to be somewhat defection proof, right? That part of the reason why you see centralization is that if you're in a context where you have a bunch of gayalals who can jump from party to party, right, every couple of weeks, the only way that you can continually build is for the voter to have a direct connection with the leader at the top. And I'll give an example of this very soon. But if it's a situation where you're a nascent party, a party with more resources comes and buys off 80% of your party, then your party is done, right? If, on the other hand, a party has a lot of resources, comes in, buys off 80% of your party, but the people who are voting for you are not voting for the individual candidates, they're voting for the leader at the top. It doesn't matter that 80% of the people are bought away, right? That's a structural phenomenon that's here. Okay? So I'm going to argue that it's exactly this sort of leader-centric. And so when we see sort of political centralization come, it's a function of the fact that when Congress party starts breaking down in the late 1980s, we get a lot of small parties. These incentives for political centralization, what I call party retrenchment, create very similar looking parties, even if the motivations to create those parties are very, very different. Okay, so here's an example, okay? This is a set of quotes from actually the 2016 election that took place, not the most recent West Bengal election, but the election before that. So this is Mamata Banerjee, the leader of a dominant party in West Bengal that out of 294 seats has consistently won more than 200 seats, right? So it's consistently winning. Now in 2016, when she went on the campaign trail, she very explicitly said, you don't look at anyone else, you vote for me, right? I am the candidate for all 294 seats. Don't look at the MLA, don't look at the individual candidate, look at me. I've written a lot about political centralization at the center, Modi. there are several quotes of ministers of, top party brass using almost the exact same quote for Narendra Modi, right? So it's a very similar sort of structure, right? So here's just a line from the piece that had been written in India Today in 2016. Consciously or unconsciously, she keeps building bridges with people, giving them the full liberty of a face-to-face interaction with the chief minister, right? So the kind of personalization of politics that necessarily makes you less dependent on local politicians and local candidates, right? It's you are voting for the person at the top. Okay, so I know this is not an abstract audience. I promise I have shifted out almost all of the math from this presentation, but I want to give a sense of, first of all, why the talk is called what it is and what the sort of underlying theoretical constraint is. So here's a well-known problem in the study of social and political preferences, and we call them cyclical preferences, okay? So let's imagine a population of 3 people or 3 parties, X, Y, and Z. Each person is given 1 crore each, okay? So 1 crore is 10 million, okay? Person Y proposes 50 lakhs, so cuts person X's stuff in half, but gives a little bit more to Y and Z. In majority voting, Y and Z will vote for it because they're getting more. Then person Z says, well, okay, I can see that somebody's not doing so well here. I'm going to give 75 lakhs to X and Y. I'm going to keep 1.5 crore for myself. I'll vote for it, right? Because I'm getting more money. And person X will vote for it because he's getting more than 50 lakhs. So person X and Z prefer. So in majority voting, again, 2 out of 3. And then person X just says, okay, well, I'm just gonna propose the status quo again. And then again, 2 people are better off. X and Y are better off. So we call this cyclical preferences. Basically, what it means is that without more structure on the system, if it is simply about which group will get more or which party will get more, this can just sort of circle in all kinds of crazy ways, right? And so one of the key answers that is proposed in political science for how we get out of this trouble is exactly the strength of political parties and the strength of ideology, right? So when you have a left-right dimension, when you have very, very strong party attachment, basically it cannot ever be the case that at once Y prefers Z, decides to go along with Z, and then also goes along with X sometimes, right? People have sort of ideological dispositions, right? That's what prevents cyclical preferences from happening. So there's a very famous theorem in social choice theory, which is literally called the chaos theorem. And the chaos theorem basically says that whenever you have a group of people who are operating under majority vote, you get chaos. Okay, you cannot actually ever get stable preferences. Okay, so this is basically, I'm just sort of saying in a few more words what I just said, that the solution that we have in political science is strong political identity and ideology. But there are very, very explicit empirical implications of this. So in the US or in many Western countries, I'm going to give one exception in a second, you get very, very low rates of defection, right? Much, much lower than you see in India or anywhere in Africa or anywhere in the developing world. And the argument is basically because there's ideological consolidation and party consolidation, people just simply, it makes no sense for a Democrat to then jump and become a Republican. It makes no sense for a Tory to then become a Labor in the Labor Party, right? Whereas here in India or in many African countries, that is not unusual at all, right? We have one sort of interesting case, and this I was talking to Diego about before I came here. So in the early 1990s, the Italians changed their electoral system. And I don't want to go into the changes they made because it's extremely complicated and some of it was in the courts. But shall we say that it was something between a first past the post system and proportional representation, which created a complete mess. Okay, so these are 2 well-known sociologists, Peter Behrman and Paolo Parigi. So Peter Behrman is at Columbia when I was there, and Paolo Parigi is at Stanford. And they studied this election very, very clearly, and said introducing these reforms during a period of political realignment yielded unexpected results, including radically new strategies for alliance formation, resulting in party fragmentation, an unprecedented expansion of the number of political parties, and a structure of often contradictory political alliances so deeply tangled, knotty, and cyclic that it might be best pictured as a bowl of overcooked spaghetti. Right? So you know, the point here is that you were in a context that was actually defined by ideological stability. You change the rules of the game and all kinds of crazy things happened. So we know that between 1996 and 2001 in the Chamber of Deputies, we have 25% of the sitting legislators either defect or cross to another party, right? So it's extreme. But I want to argue that this is not a good comparison for what we have in India or Africa or much of the developing world, because this is a momentary realignment. So actually, there had been almost no defection in Italy for a very long period of time. As Diego reminded me, there was a period somewhere in the early 20th century where there was a lot of defection. But these are sort of transformative moments, right? And then it goes back to some kind of stability, right? The Indian context is one in which defection is happening all the time. Right. In fact, it's a founding problem for a lot of sort of what parties and political parties do. So in the Indian context, even in 2021, around 10% of sitting legislators were floor crossing. If we look at defection, which is people who never actually got elected and jumped parties, the numbers would be way, way higher. Okay, that's from the Association for Democratic Reforms. In the national parliament, a candidate only has a 50% chance of being renominated. If you're renominated, then you'll have a 50% chance of winning the election. So 25% chance of incumbency, right? 50% times 50%. We see this in other developing countries. We see this in Africa. We see this in many countries that are sort of younger democracies. But when we look at similar things in Western democracies, almost all of them have incumbency of 70% plus. So, right, so renomination plus winning, right? So almost every sitting legislator gets renominated, and almost all of those people getting renominated get elected again. There's an extraordinary stability. Right? Okay, so I'm sorry this came out very grainy, but I want to sort of point out that what I'm saying here, I've put a lot of abstract language to it, is not a new problem, okay? India, from the very, very beginning, the political parties were worried about political defection. There were several attempts made and several parliamentary committees that were created to think about how to stem defection, okay? So I'm gonna sort of point out one of our, probably the most prominent of them, the Y.B. Chauhan Committee in 1967. It was a parliamentary committee across all parties. And it actually says it's a very detailed report. And this is sort of the set of recommendations there. I've cut off the last recommendation because it was silly, but this is the meat of the recommendations. Now, what I want to sort of show you is that even these guys, who had all clearly been reading Western political thought, said, well, you know, India is a new country, right? At this point, only 20 years of independence. We're in a transition, right? Eventually, we're going to get to a period of ideological polarization, clarity, and so on. But right now, we're in a period of transition, so we need to think about how to deal with defection. Now, as you can see from this slide, some 50 years on, we're still in a period of transition. So perhaps we should start thinking about why is this natural and less about why is this not a transition. Okay. Okay. So one way to induce stability, right, is to think a little bit about how voters might structure things. Now, I'm going to jump over this because it's a mathematical proof. But I just want to make one sort of point. If we can imagine a world in which at the constituency level, there's enough understanding about which party might win with what probability, then all of the problems that I described earlier about chaos can be mitigated, and we can think about how voters might be both sincere and strategic in that context. Okay. The other implication of this is that if that knowledge is known, then parties also can calculate the probability of winning every seat and the probability of forming government, the probability of how many seats they may win, right? And the key sort of idea that I want to sort of think about here is that when you're a young party, the thing that you are most concerned about is whether your party is going to get decimated, right? You're a young party, you can only plausibly win 20 seats. If instead of I've competed 20 seats, I only win one, I'm probably done for. If I compete in 20 seats and I win 7 or 8, maybe I can continue to grow. So because I'm a young party, I am very, very concerned about downside risk. What I do not want is a very candidate-centric system, because if people are voting for candidates, candidates can jump away, and I'm reliant on candidates, then it's going to be very hard for my party to grow. On the other hand, if everything is about the leader, then the variation in my support across all the places in which I can potentially win is going to be very low, right? And it turns out that that's a very good way of preventing at least decimation. You may not win outright because you're not taking a chance. Contrast that to a dominant party, what the Congress party did, what the BJP party is doing today. If you're a dominant player with many more resources, then your optimal strategy is actually to co-opt the best candidate in every constituency, just buy them off, right? Because you know who the most popular guy is. I'll let them do what they're going to do. And I will clearly win because I have the most popular person in every constituency. Okay, so I'm going to now just sort of go through some of the data work. As I said, I've stripped much of this talk of the data work, but I wanted to sort of talk through the theory and then sort of talk a little bit about implications, where I want to spend a little more time. So I want to sort of, so what I've done in this data set is that I've looked at every election from 1977 to 2007. The reason why I've done 77, 2007 is after the emergency, and the boundaries of constituencies stay the same, so we can fairly look at whether re-election is happening and so on and so forth, right? I've taken the data from Trivedi Center for Political Data, TCPD. Now, when we take all of these elections together, we have around 30,000 constituencies. And I'm going to only look at the top 2 parties. Now, this is a thing that I do in a lot of my papers. And the reason is that all of your metrics are off if you consider every party, right? So let's say that I want to understand, did somebody defect to another party because they wanted to win? Or did somebody just defect, right? So often what happens is a very competitive party doesn't give Rohan the party ticket. Rohan's like, I'm very angry. I still want to contest. I'm going to go contest as an independent candidate. Rohan will get 1% of the vote, right? But, you know, he's still contested. Now, we don't really want to think about that as any genuine defection is gone. What we're worried about is Rohan was in the Congress party. He got a better deal with the BJP, who's also competitive. He jumped to the BJP, won there, right? So the reason to restrict to the top 2 parties is that we typically only have 2 competitive parties at the constituency level. And a lot of these arguments only sort of hold water if we're talking about, it sort of makes it a harder case, right? I'm going to restrict just for reasons that, you know, one of the objections people have is that if you stick to, of course, everything's going to work out if I take very, very tiny parties, because some of them will survive, some of them won't survive. So I'm going to take parties that have won at least 20% of constituencies in a state at some point in their history over this period. So at some point had gained a foothold. We're looking at about 26,000 constituencies. And I'm going to define national parties as parties over this period that reached this 20% bar in at least 3 states. And these are you can play around with how you create the bars. You're going to get this is a very intuitive set of parties, which is why I've chosen this. It could be anything else, right? So BJP, Congress, Congress I, Congress U. For those who know the history, there was a period when the Congress split, and Congress I then went back to Congress. Congress U went on. Lok Dal is Charan Singh's party. CPM is the Communist Party Marxist. Janta Dal, which was a combination of multiple parties, and Janta Party, which showed up later. Okay. So first things first. From this data, looking at every state election from 1977, I've actually extended this to 2022, doing a couple of manipulations. Look at what happens in the 1990s, right? So you have effective number of parties around 4. And just give you a sense of what this formula is. What the formula does is it looks at the relative strength of parties, right? So let's say I have only 2 parties in the system and they are equally weighted. So each party has 50% of the seats. That'll be an effective number of parties of 2. However, if let's say one party has 90% of the seats and the other party has 10% of the seats, that's going to drop well below 2. It's going to move towards 1. So that's kind of what that's what this formula does. It's known as a Herfindahl index, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the number of seats that have been won all across the country at the state level, year by year, and I'm going to calculate the effective number of parties. Okay, and you can see that after the emergency in 1977, it's relatively low at 4, and come Congress breakdown, spike, right? 1990s stays very, very high, and then we're getting a Modi effect, BJP effect. It's coming down. It's still quite a bit higher than it was here. Okay, so when I say that I'm interested in the transformation that took place in the 90s, in a very genuine sense, almost all of these parties, so all these parties I listed here, were outside of the band of the 1990s. So none of the new parties that we're seeing here coming that are national parties. They're almost all these kind of small leader-centric parties that I talked about, right? Okay, before I go there. So one important mathematical result, right? So what I want to sort of, what I want to argue here is we should have empirical evidence that the probability of decimation for parties is a genuine concern, okay? And we should have some evidence that party retrenchment is happening, which is to say that non-national parties are more likely to take inexperienced candidates because it's all about the leader. We're not as dependent on the candidate characteristics like the Congress and the BJP are. So what I'm going to do here is I've written 5 percentage points because that's what I've done for the model, but I've only shown you 2 percentage points. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at contests in which a national party is competing against one of these small, highly centralized parties, okay? And I'm going to look at the difference in the probability that the small party survives versus the national party, okay? So if we're on this side, the small party has defeated the national party, and if we're on this side, the national party has defeated the small party. These are very close elections, and typically in statistics, we imagine that when you have very, very close elections, who wins is a bit of a coin flip. So what this tells us is right at this boundary, it's telling us what is the relative impact on the survival of small parties if just by random chance the small party wins, as opposed to if the small party loses against the national party. And what you can see here is that, in fact, there is a huge difference, right? So what you can, so I'm going to first interpret this curve to the right, okay? The curve to the right is saying actually the chance of survival for a small party vis-a-vis a national party is actually slightly higher, right? If they happen to win, but it's close to 0. You can kind of see this thing is trending near 0, right? So one way to think about that is if the national party loses, the national party doesn't really die, right? But it is true that at least the small party will survive on par with the national party. On the other hand, if just by random chance the small party loses, it is about 20 to 30 percentage points less likely to survive than a national party. So it's pretty bad, right? So even losing in a close election, not being able to win the seat, really sort of makes it much more likely for your party to be decimated. That's sort of implication of this, right? And so this is just to sort of point out that, those parties that are coming up in the 1990s, these are very, very genuine concerns. And so you don't want actors that are even costing you 1 or 2 percentage points. You don't want candidates creating, you want as much uniformity in your vote share as possible, just so you don't jump to this side and have a much higher chance of being decimated. This analysis could be a lot better. I'm still working on it. But what I have done is I have looked at 3 kinds of competition when 2 national parties are competing against each other in this period, when a national party is competing against a small party, and when 2 small parties are competing against each other, and just looked at the average number of terms that their candidates have. And you can see that the average number of terms for small parties, or whenever a small party is involved, is lesser than that of the average number of terms when 2 national parties are involved. And these differences, even if they look small, are actually very significant. Okay. I need a much more robust way of showing this. This is very much work in progress. I'm in the process of actually coding up defections from small parties and big parties and trying to understand what is the relative impact of defecting from each kind of party. Okay. So I want to sort of end with 2 things that we know about the Indian political system today that have been written about quite a bit, and want to argue that the procedure that I've just talked about and what happened in the 1990s can help us think about what is happening today. Okay, so this graph is from a chapter I wrote in a volume called Costs of Democracy. And the argument that I made is that there's a reason why we're seeing wealthier and wealthier candidates, much wealthier candidates, entering into electoral politics in India. So what this graph is showing, so C is competitive candidates, top 2 parties again, and C is not competitive candidates. Don't worry about movable and non-movable. Let's look at total wealth. And what you can see is that between 2004 and 2014, the median wealth of people competing in competitive parties goes up 9 times, right? It's become an arms race, right? And so one might wonder, people have made similar observations about the number of people with criminal cases against them entering politics in India. One might wonder what is going on? Why are we seeing this? Now let me flip it back. We now have a very high number of parties, and now including the national parties, right, which have the kind of political centralization that I'm talking about. What are your opportunities for being renominated? What are your chances to win a seat again? What are your chances to ever make a policy impact, right? Almost all policy is very tightly controlled at the top of every one of these political parties, right? At the state level, it's the chief minister's office. At the national level, increasingly, it's the prime minister's office, right? So if I know that I have no incentive to invest in my capacity as a legislator, and it's very expensive to contest elections, and I'm probably going to have to spend a lot of my own money, then what kind of person is likely to enter politics, and what are they likely to do when they get there? Somebody wealthy is likely to enter politics because politics is expensive. Somebody has invested a lot of money into getting elected, but they're likely not going to get renominated again, nor are they going to make a policy impact. So how do I recoup my investment? Right? Simple question. Right? So when we get concerned about this sort of increasing nexus of criminality, wealth, corruption, I think a lot of it stems from the sheer lack of internal party democracy that has taken root since the 1990s, but continues to grow. And this is my final slide, something that I waited until the last slide to talk about it. But my typical argument about what is happening in India today is that we're seeing extraordinary levels of political centralization. That is clear to any observer. The most powerful office at the center is the Prime Minister's office. And we often forget in our analysis of Modi, other than certain actions that were taken during Hindu-Muslim riots and so on and so forth, that Modi is a state leader par excellence, right? He is coming from a national party, but he became a dominant state party leader in Gujarat before he ever ascended to the throne. So my one-liner about what's happening in India is that Modi and Amit Shah haven't nationalized Indian politics, they've regionalized it. They're actually behaving in the way that many of these regional parties and many of these sort of highly centralized political parties had been behaving from the 1990s. And here's just an example of what some of the empirical implications are. This is actually a piece that I wrote for Ronajoy in an EPW issue. And what I was looking at is trying to understand a very simple question. In 2019, the BJP's vote share in this set of states was the black bars. These gray bars, these lighter bars, are the BJP's vote shares in subsequent and in some cases, like Orissa, simultaneous elections. And you see that there are huge gaps for the BJP today in how they perform in national elections versus state elections. We imagine this might happen in 2024. The argument that I made, and I continue to believe, is that much like that story I started around with Mamata Banerjee, we have politics today, which is based upon Modi building a direct connection to the voter, right? There's a centralizing tendency, and that is essentially cutting out the middleman. Many of the well-known BJP chief ministers, whether it's Shivraj Singh Chauhan, whether it's Raman Singh in Chhattisgarh, these are people who built their names on welfare delivery. Come Modi, there's one person who can give you welfare, and it's the man at the top. So overnight, the people who had built their reputation on being able to deliver and sort of other kinds of politics, they've been undercut. And so I end that piece on a very ominous note, which is to say that the only chief ministers who can distinguish themselves are going to be those who come to power during the Modi-Amit Shah era. And they're not going to distinguish themselves on welfare delivery, but on Hindu-Muslim polarization and on law and order, right? At that time, it only referred to Yogi Adityanath. Since then, we have seen Himanta Biswa Sharma also in Assam join the fold and start doing very similar kinds of politics. And increasingly, we're seeing Shivraj Singh Chauhan, who was known as the welfarist par excellence in Madhya Pradesh. He has gone from being Mama, uncle, somebody who will give me benefits, to bulldozer Mama, because he's going and bulldozing settlements of Muslims, right? So we are now in a context where this kind of political centralization, an idea that started in the 1990s due to the fact that there isn't ideological consolidation, is kind of reaching the apex level of politics, and it's having certain consequences that we're seeing across the political system. So I'm going to leave it right there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Neil. As you gather your thoughts, I will use my authority as chair to ask the first question, which is the first one is just to continue where you left. So what's the antidote? What's the solution, if there is any? Because we see that you are linking this to corruption, to criminality, to lack of democracy, so is there any solution? Clearly, the anti-defection law didn't work. How do you do it? And how, I don't know, I can think of public funding of political parties, but maybe it's too late, that ship must have sailed and will never return. So this is really my question. The other is that you say that, parties centralize to be defection proof. And so they are leader-centric because candidates don't matter. But this also means that it gives incentives for, of course, politicians in other parties to join your party. Sure. So if everybody does the same thing, basically there are huge incentives just to defect, which is so it's a circle, and it's just yeah, I don't know. Anyway.
So let me take the latter one first. So there's a part of this talk that I cut because this was already complicated enough. But just to sort of give a sense of some of the characters that we've had. So some of you in the room know Sharad Pawar's history. So soon after he was connected to the Congress Party, then a breakaway within the Congress Party U. Then he started Congress Party Socialist, right? So ICS, right? Then by the late 80s, it became clear that his party was going to fall apart. So he went back to the Congress Party. Then in 1999, he was no longer a socialist, he was now a nationalist, and he started the Nationalist Congress Party, right? NCP, which today exists. Another version of this, right, is Ajit Singh, so Charan Singh's son, takes over this Lokdal party. Lokdal splits into Lokdal A and Lokdal B because people are tired of putting, monikers. Okay, Lokdal A then merges into the Janta Party. Now, in the case of Sharad Pawar, I view him as like somebody who's like, he's like, your startup guy, right? Every person I know with a successful startup has 3 failed startups, right? The guy, he was clearly always trying to, when he merged back to the Congress Party, his party was decimated. In the case of Ajit Singh, he becomes the president of the Janta Party, actually, when he joins. So when the Lokdal joins into the Janta Party, he becomes the president. So he's not decimating, he's actually creating a larger space for other people to defect into, right? So there are a couple of questions. So first of all, in the 1980s, this behavior is much less successful. Sharad Pawar fundamentally, and many people like Sharad Pawar have to. So if you look at the Congress Party breakaways until the 90s, many of them go back to the Congress Party. If you look at the mid to late 90s onward, almost very few of them go back to the Congress Party, right? So there is something to be said up for the kinds of defection incentives that we started seeing in the 1980s. The other part of what you said, I very much agree, right, is that while the initial motivation may have been to make yourself a little more defection proof, in practice, what you have done is you've made every candidate and legislator relatively useless to the actual policy making structure. And therefore, you have just massively increased incentives for defection, resort politics, something we know very much in India, where a wealthy party goes and just literally buys off a bunch of candidates and forms government. In order to prevent that from happening, often a party will take its legislators and lock them into a resort without any communication with the outside world to prevent them from being bought off. These sort of humorously ridiculous politics that happens after any government is formed in an Indian state, right? So, and the reason why it's happening is that that's who these guys are. They have no incentive to actually invest ideologically, policy-wise, anything into any of these parties. What is the antidote? So I don't know. I think things have certainly gotten a lot worse. What I would say is that we are in a context in which, and this is a sobering thought, when a dictator loses, they lose to another dictator, right? I mean, at the state level, we've had many dominant parties or dominant political leaders. When they finally lose, it looks like they lose to somebody else with a very, very similar structure. So at least empirically, that seems to be, Akhilesh Yadav loses, he loses to Yogi Adityanath, right? I mean, that's kind of what's happening. So at least in the short term, I think that is the kind of politics that we see. There is no antidote unless there is a larger structural formation in terms of ideology. I think in that way, the people who were part of that old parliamentary committee had picked up on the cardinal problem from the very beginning. The final thing, just sort of an abstract thought I would say is, comment that I've made to others is that for those of us who study comparative politics and political parties around the world, it's a bit strange that one of the biggest jibes against the Congress Party is that I don't know that the president of the party is leader material, right? If it really is about party identity and ideology, we typically, most people who voted for the Democrats didn't think that Biden was president material, but still voted for him, right? I think the idea that we can't even imagine a politics without identifying the leader with the party is a very real outcome of these kinds of structures. And I don't think this is just about India, but I think looking at India and trying to theorize from India tells you a lot about what's happening in many other contexts in the development.
Thank you. Yes. Ranjoy, Amitandu, Imran. Go on.
Hi, Nilanjan, thanks for the talk. You covered a whole range of issues in addition or related to centralization. I had a question on the anti-defection law rules which Diego raised, and there's one school of thought articulated by people like Madhav and of PRS that the defection law should be scrapped. It has no utility anymore. So maybe I just wanted your thoughts on that. Is there any way to tweak it, or it's essentially completely loose? And the second question is the whole question which you touched on in your response to Diego, is the the place of ideology, and that nice quote from the Chevan committee. And we also have had a fairly recent book by Rahul Verma and Chibar, which I don't know, they make an argument for two axes in which ideology distinguishes parties, but I'm not entirely convinced. But do you think that the only real distinguishing characteristic might be on the question of secularism / majoritarianism between you have a set of parties which are strongly maybe majoritarian or less, but whereas others are maybe weakly secular, but they distinguish themselves on that axis. Other than that, it seems like there's really no distinguishing way distinguish between parties in India, contrary to what Chibar and Verma argue. Yeah.
So should we? Okay.
Thank you, Nilanjan. That was very illuminating. I have two questions. The first of this is I was trying to come back to what you refer to as defection incentives and trying to connect it to this broader trend of political centralization. We have seen defections happening earlier in Indian politics, 70s, 80s. I remember in 80s, Ronojoy would recall there was this specific example of Mr. Pranab Mukherjee having moved out of the Congress and created a party, the Congress Indira Subhash, and then he came back, which actually sunk without a flutter. Now, what we see today is a very different cup of defection. People switching sides like taking buses. Now, I wanted to check something with you on this. Do you think this is happening because the ability of the average politician in India to deliver for his constituency and, on the vote promises has actually gone down compared with what it was in the past? And has it got anything to do with the fact that now the constituents are actually part of a process where they don't need the politician that much more for public service deliveries? Earlier, the politician was an intermediary in many respects, cooking gas connections, electricity connections, education in school. But now the politician has been cut away from most of this. Has it got something to do with the fact that this makes the politician much more vulnerable in his existence or her existence? And that incentivizes centralization, closer to a bigger system. That was the first question. I'd be happy to have your thoughts on this. The second is, I was wondering that, that last ENP that you produced, and you showed these three graphs, the national, small, national, small. How does a state like Tamil Nadu look in this context? Because Tamil Nadu typically hasn't been a state which has seen too much of the national parties competing with each other. It's the Revitan politics playing out between two parties. So how does it look in that regard? Thank you.
Thanks, Nina. So that was a great description, analysis of this trend. I guess, a little bit curious about the causes, because it seems to suggest that centralization is this new force, or perhaps even a prior force that sits alongside or prior to a lot of other driving forces that we've been told drive Indian politics, like the money stuff, the muscle or whatever, right? Milan's book and so on, right? So I guess, what is the causal process by which this comes about in the 90s? Like you described it as the idea of centralization, but where does the idea, like, are there structural forces that are driving this? So is it the decline of the Congress Party? Is it the massive influx of money into the Indian economy and therefore into politics? Is it changes in campaign finance? I mean, what is the sequencing of this? Is this a response to those things? Or is it purely a defection story, right? It seems to me that you're saying centralization causes a lot of the other things, but is there a way where we can think about it where those things actually contribute to centralization? That's just one thing. And the other thing is the logic of it, which is, I don't know if this is a story about centralization versus personification of politics, right? Which is that centralization, I think Diego was touching on this, it sort of runs counter to the logic of what you're trying to do if you want to prevent defections. Actually, you might want to create pathways for people to rise up within parties, at least give them a sense that they might, the whole point of the Congress being yes, the leader of the Congress doesn't have leadership qualities or whatever, as the people say, but people have also said that there is no intra-party democracy within the Congress, right? A party like, so think about the 90s BJP with Pramod Mahajan and Arun Jaitley and all these, it was fairly like Politburo-ish kind of decision making, although it wasn't that. That wasn't the CPI. But you want to give people pathways to feel like they can get to the top of the party, right? That to me seems like a much more successful strategy of preventing defection than centralizing power, which leads to frustration, right? So maybe what it is actually personification. It's almost this like Maoist thing of like cutting across the middle tier and going straight to the people. It's what Indira Gandhi used to do as well. So I guess, are we talking about the right phenomenon here in terms of the logic of the cause? Yeah.
Okay. Yes. No, I have lots of notes. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I was going to ask a question about the anti-defection law, but Ronojoy expressed it much better than I could ever. So I might just ask something. You mentioned about how, given these circumstances, the leadership kind of differentiates itself using Hindu-Muslim polarization. I was wondering if you could just talk about that a little bit more.
Okay, so I am not going to do a great job, I think, of answering all these very difficult questions, but let me try to do justice to everybody's questions. So let me start with Ronojoy's comments. So I'll get to the anti-defection law in a second. So let's start with the question of what are the issues that might distinguish parties. So I'm, even though he's my colleague, I don't buy Pradeep Shibber and Rahul Verma's argument about ideology very much. There are a couple of reasons. The most obvious reason is that their axes are about how much state intervention you want in the economy, and something about minority rights. And so the example, for instance, they have of a group that doesn't want much state intervention in the economy is the farmers. They probably wouldn't have written that had they'd written the book a couple of years later, right? So one of the principles we have about what ideology means is that it's fixed. If ideology can move, if today I say I'm right wing and tomorrow I say I'm left wing, and there's no meaning to the ideological dimension, right? The other sort of the other concern that I have is that it's what I started with. One thing that we know is that the way that ideology is meant for social scientists, you should have ideological consolidation. You just simply shouldn't have this kind of political defection, and you shouldn't have this kind of movement of political actors. It can't be that Jyotiraditya Scindia one day is railing against the BJP and the next day is, hyper Hindutva, right? That sort of doesn't make sense in any kind of ideological consolidated system. So, I want to make one distinction here, right? And it's the point that you bring up, like, is it secularism, non-secularism? So I do think, and I very much put myself in this camp, I think that a lot of social scientists view ethnic politics and ethno-nationalism as not something that should be confused with ideological politics, right? And The distinction, I think, actually, one of the pieces that I was looking at for Italian politics, this woman, I think her name is Carol Mershon, I think is her name. So she's written a lot about this period. She makes an interesting point, so that, the difference between ethnic politics and ideological politics is that in ethnic politics, you say who a policy is for. You don't say what the policy is, right? It's very close to the distinction between programmatic politics and non-programmatic politics, right? So if you think about the kinds of debates you have, it's a hard thing to define, but it's kind of debates that you have in ideology consolidated systems about what should be happening with pension and sorts. That is not the structure in which narratives are made in ethnic politics. So something that could be seen as a very Hindu issue, the next day becomes a very non-Hindu issue. This is sort of what the structure of ethnic politics is, right? So I do agree that there is differentiation among the parties, ethnically, caste, religion, so on and so forth, but I wouldn't necessarily put that alongside ideological politics. Should the anti-defection law be scrapped? So yes, but only as a sort of a moral principle. I think it's in principle, I know we have all of these problems, but there might actually be very good reasons to defect from a party, especially in a highly centralized system. There can be all kinds of abuses. So, there should be that kind of movement. And as you point out, I mean, it's not like it's worked. So whether you have the anti-defection law or not, it's not like you're reducing rates of defection very much. So why not actually keep the more ethical principle intact if defection is going to happen anyway? Okay. So Amit Indu asked actually another project I'm working on, and I think this is something that even Diego has thought through some. So my colleague and president of CPR, Yamini Iyer, and I have been working quite a bit on thinking about, basically she came from the policy side and I came from this side, and we ran headlong into direct benefit transfers, DBTs, grievance, and so on and so forth. So I can actually talk a lot about this, but just one sort of small thing. If you think about the mechanism I talked about, right, which is about building a direct connection between voter and leader at the top, which has always been an incentive in this kind of politics. The direct benefit transfer story, the idea that the chief minister or the prime minister can push a button and give benefits to all of these people and brand it in their image, is exactly what you want. And it very much cuts out all of these other middle actors. Increasingly, because I work a lot in the policy space, so I have been a part of these systems, increasingly all decisions on benefits, the optimal strategy has been seen as cutting out any kind of local bargaining on why and who should get benefits, and making all decisions at the chief minister's office or the prime minister's office. In addition to that, grievances. Now all of these states have new grievance structures. You call or put your grievance into a portal. And that portal has a war room somewhere sitting in the chief minister's office or the prime minister's office. And they call back and they address. So there's a very explicit cutting out of any other actor to further bolster centralization. So I think that's very much what is happening. Just very quickly on Tamil Nadu. So at least the way that's coded here, it's small party versus small party. Neither of them are national parties. In many ways, the things that happened in Tamil Nadu, they showed the way for many of the things that we would start to see in other states. Which is why, I mean, just maybe a little bit more positive that it might be this kind of centralization that's leading to a certain kind of welfare delivery, but many of the southern states and Tamil Nadu in particular shows that it doesn't necessarily lead to bad welfare and social outcomes. Okay, Rohan's question about the causal process and a more difficult question for me to answer about centralization and personification. And I had skirted it until now, until you correctly, I think, asked the question. I'll do my best to sort of try to explain why I'm saying things the way that I am. So first, on the causal process, so at least empirically, we know that there are two major reasons why you end up getting this proliferation of actors. One is the Congress party falling apart, and the second is the Janata Dal falling apart, right? So almost all of these parties are associated. I mean, you have to move very far into the future beyond, Aam Aadmi Party starts showing up, to start really seeing new parties that don't have roots in any of these two places, right? So almost all of these caste-wise parties, and many of them kept the name Janta Dal, right? Rashtriya Janta Dal, JDU, JDS, right? They kept the name Janta Dal. They're out of the Janta Dal itself, right? Or they have broken away from the Congress. So in terms of the initiation point, that's where it is, right? That's why in the early 80s and mid 80s, you see a lot of them not being so successful, but finally when those parties really kind of fall apart, then you have to go on your own. Now, there's a question about the endogeneity of these things. So I very much agree, right? I mean, in some sense, I'm arguing that centralization is a function of all of these things. And then at the end of the talk, I said, well, now because you're so centralized, now you have incentives to do all of these things, right? What I would say in defense, though, is that because we have such a cataclysmic end of the existing party structure to this huge proliferation of new parties, that, in this structural transformation, there is a question about what is the optimal way for these new small parties to structure themselves, right? And that's why you see it, right? Are there incentives to centralize? Sure, right? Have there always been? Sure. But being a new small party that has to survive the next 10, 15 years is a challenge that is fairly unique to that period, right? And so that's sort of why I started that. Centralization versus personification. So this one is hard. I mean, look, clearly the two are very related. I call them, in an earlier iteration of this project, I used to call them family-owned firms. So putting it, very, very explicitly. But I'll tell you, why I have a harder time with directly linking the two now is that you rightly point out that Indira Gandhi is also a certain kind of personalization of politics, but it's a dominant party. Modi is also a personalization of politics, right? So while certain aspects of how this politics is done migrates to the center, these are still dominant parties that can buy off other political actors in various ways. And so the set of strategies that are being used by a big, large, dominant party on the ground is still noticeably different than what one of these small parties might be doing. Until recently, now, Trinamool actually turns out to be a very wealthy party. They figured out how to make use of the resources of the state to make themselves a wealthy party. But until very recently, many of these parties were not obviously wealthy, but still were able to make do because of the way in which they're centralized. So I'm not sure that I've come up with the right language, but I do think it requires some parsing as to what work is personalization doing, which is building the direct connection to the voter, and what work is the centralization doing, which is making sure that you're not dependent on the fortunes of the candidate. Now, Imran's question, if I can talk a little bit more about this distinction between welfare and law and order. So look, I mean, there's no nice way to say it. I think we do see that while chief ministers that are regional party leaders are distinguishing themselves on welfare delivery, you can be Mamata Banerjee, you can be Jagan Reddy. Chief ministers that have particularly come after 2014 in the BJP are typically distinguishing themselves on the basis of being able to do what they call law and order, but essentially play up Hindu-Muslim distinctions. Right? I gave an example of several of those chief ministers, but I said, I think the mechanism there is that because welfare attribution has to go to the top, it is no longer an avenue for chief ministers in order to win, right? So you actually see that sometimes, and part of the reason why the BJP has lost a lot of these states, right, is that they're often caught flat-footed against a regional leader who can claim welfare delivery and many other things. Like when the BJP came into West Bengal, right, they don't really credibly commit, can they credibly commit to state level distribution of benefits in the way that these regional actors can. So while it has strengthened the party at the center, it has weakened a lot of the lower level actors within the BJP. So,
any question? Yeah.
Thank you, Ranjan. Just wanted to try to put a political economy frame to this discussion. I'm wondering if and also connecting it to some of the points raised on the causes and the structural conditions. Is it possible to explain or think about political centralization in India without talking about corporate centralization in India and kind of the levels of private power that you see in India and the Indian economy today? I'm just wondering how and where do you fit that in to your story? And how does that also link into the regionalization argument, right? Because then that kind of undercuts your argument on the regionalization of Indian politics, because my guess is states don't have the access, the links to global capital as that which the national government has, right? So I'm just kind of trying to think through these 2 points here, and if there is a connection, and where do you come on business politics relations in India? Thanks.
so there's a piece I'd written some years back, which I had to bury a little bit because I live in India. So let me sort of trace what the argument there is, and maybe that helps, right? So one of my colleagues at CPR and also journalist at Indian Express, a guy named Harish Damodharan. He spends a lot of time in agricultural areas, but also he's a observer of local political economy. And so the argument that he's been making for a while is that at least decades ago, what was the source of money? Was this first, sort of local business people, people in real estate, construction builders? There was a lot of capital in this class, particularly after liberalization. Then starts UPA 2 is when you start really seeing the trend up. You start seeing that the big corporate actors, just the gains to their wealth versus anyone else, is increasing inequality. The top actors are gaining disproportionately high levels of wealth. So much so that by the end of the demonetization period, so by 2017, 2018, we calculate, depending on whose numbers you use, about 70 to 80% of India's profits accrue to the top 20 firms in the country. So if you were to look at the World Income Inequality Database, right, India's top 1% of income is like that of Russia now. So it is not the Anglo-American level of inequality. It is not the East Asian, Southeast Asian level of inequality, which is actually less than the Anglo-American level of inequality. It is out of the stratosphere, right? The level of political centralization and economic centralization you have. The argument that I sort of make in that piece is that as you've had centralization at the top in Modi, you've had increased incentives for economic centralization for the following reason. Many of these actors are operating across states, as you said. So I can't go to a state level actor, I'm going to have to go to a national level actor. National level actor is going to say, well, I can make your life easier, but you have to figure out a way of routing some of the money to me, right? Some of that might be electoral bonds, how political financing is done. Some of that might be other ways of giving kickbacks, not different than how any other political party has done, quite honestly, but it's just scaled, right? So today, you've created an explicit nexus and pass-through that involves economic centralization and political centralization working in tandem. Greater economic centralization means that policy is affected to further allow centralization. Some percentage of that money is able to come back to the political party, which gets disproportionate amount of resources compared to every other political actor, which aids itself in centralization and vice versa. Right? That's kind of what the structure looks like. But I think we're very much in that mode. And there's a good question to be asked about, which I tried to sort of end the talk with, but there's much more to go, which is when we take the regional model of centralization and move it to the center, what are other things that start showing up in the system, right? One of them is a distinction between state and national politics, but one of them is perhaps this kind of economic centralization. I mean, if you look at how many of these state level leaders have operated in their own states, and Modi himself when he was in Gujarat, and many of the other people I talked about here, right, BJP or not, they very much use their corporates in this manner. This is just simply working at a different scale.
Last but not least, sure.
Hi, Nilanjan, thanks. I had a good question, but that's already been asked. So I'm going to ask a half-baked question and perhaps an unfair question as well. So pardon me. Let me start with the half-baked question first. I'm thinking in terms of centralization in an age of, say, I'm thinking here about the upcoming national elections and the opposition coalitions that are in talks, right? One would assume that if one has regional centralization, then a strong centralized party would be able to ensure vote transferability to its coalition partner. But we've seen in Uttar Pradesh before that votes don't transfer even if two centralized figures come into a coalition together. How would you explain that? And the other quick question I had was about, I'm thinking about states that don't seem to be heading in a centralization way. I'm thinking of Punjab in particular. You have two dominant parties there that almost seem to be anti-centralization. And yet, so how do you explain that? That, you know, you have these trends almost everywhere. Is that a political economy, or is there something about the parties themselves?
Okay, so the second question is very hard, and I'm going to tell you Punjab, because I've spent some time in Punjab, so I'll just try to give just sort of honest reflections of what I've seen. But let me start on this sort of question about poor transferability. The question is a little more complicated because poor transferability means that, so let's just take the two leaders question. Let's take Mayawati and Mulayam Singh or Akhilesh Yadav, okay? What has typically happened, what has caused the problem? If I'm a Dalit or scheduled caste voter in a constituency where a Yadav candidate is put up under the Samajwadi Party, I have enough dislike for Akhilesh Yadav that I don't want to vote for his candidate, even if my party is in working alongside. Right? So while it operates as a level of political connection, does it operate as the ability to simply shift your vote from here to there? I think that requires a second step. And the reason why is that it is perfectly logical for a Dalit voter to say that while I prefer Mayawati above all else, and something you hear, in any scenario here, Mayawati is not going to be the dominant player in government. And so I would rather not see this combined winner. I'd rather see the other combined, right? I mean, that's a perfectly rational thing to say, right? And still be beholden to Mayawati. So I think the complexities of how you actually field a candidate, right? The sort of constituency level adding together of votes is actually a very difficult problem for a lot of these parties, and why you've not seen it work, right? Especially parties that have traditionally not liked each other, or leaders who've not traditionally liked each other. I mean, Mayawati also has, you know, so I think the other thing is that even at the level of leaders, a lot of these are not great relationships, right? Mayawati believes that Mulayam tried to kill her, right? I mean, so it'll always be a little bit of a tricky relationship, right? So Punjab, I think, so I remember I ran into Surinder Jhodka some months back, and he said, "Are you going to continue writing on Punjab?" I said, I mean, not really, but why do you ask? He said, "Well, you know, there are a lot of interesting things, and you were saying some interesting things." I said, "Yeah, but it's too new. I don't really know where it's going to. I mean, I don't have anything intelligent to say about it. Let me just tell you a little bit of what I saw." So we knew that the Congress party was going to fall apart in Punjab, and the BJP was also not doing very well. there was frustration with the Akalis, the Aam Aadmi Party came in. What is crazy about the Aam Aadmi Party this time? You didn't see a single party worker. I mean, honestly, they had like nobody. They named their chief ministerial face just at election time. It was run on Delhi model, Kejriwal, and Facebook and WhatsApp and YouTube, right? This was their campaign. And yet it swept. 5 years before, when I'd been in Punjab, there was a concern that the Aam Aadmi Party was in cahoots with the Khalistanis, and it had a genuine negative impact on vote. So you would think that perhaps your optimal strategy is to, build more infrastructure. But in fact, what they did was they actually liquidated their party and made it only about one man, and that's Kejriwal. So on one hand, and this is a real question, once we have this kind of digitization, once we have this kind of welfare delivery, are we moving to a world in which that kind of boots on the ground presence is going to matter less? Punjab is, of course, very different in terms of how connected people are, right? You can run a campaign online in a way that may be not possible now in many states, but maybe in 10 years, that's different. Right? But what I saw there, right? A party that wins, it's like, I'm talking to a party worker in Congress party, and he said, we don't even know what to do. It's like punching the wind. So there's nobody there, right? I mean, it's like this is a very strange sort of problem, right? So I think Punjab requires a lot more theorization. On one level, it is a model of hyper-centralization. We cannot think of Aam Aadmi Party without Kejriwal. But still, so much of how I think about this is the party cadre is doing, what the leader is doing. None of that is what the Aam Aadmi Party is doing. There's a more complicated question about the funny game that they're playing. They realize that now with the Akalis in trouble, they can win over some of the Hindu vote. And so all they have to do is maintain somewhat of a Sikh agricultural vote and a large share of the Hindu vote, and they're in the clear, even if they're making most of the people angry most of the time, which is kind of how they think of politics.
I think we need to wrap up. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for watching online, and thank you.
Thank you for having me.